Uh, 2 years ago at our Mars Society International Convention, I gave a presentation on the Trump government's proposed Space Force and its potential impact on the human exploration of Mars. I stated then that, quote, a U.S. Space Force dedicated to achieving U.S. domination of outer space could threaten the human exploration of Mars for decades to come. So 2 years later, now that the Space Force is up and running, has that threat ended or at least been diminished? No. In fact, all hard facts and documents indicate that the threat has become much greater than 2 years ago. Why is that? Isn't the Space Force being organized as a purely defensive force designed to protect U.S. military, science, and business-related satellites from attack from other nations? That's what we've been told. But no, that's not true. The aims and objectives of the U.S. Space Force have been made crystal clear by government officials and the military brass in documents and public statements. And their goal is the absolute domination and control in our solar system. As Donald Trump himself explained at a Marine Corps base last year, quote, outer space is a war-fighting domain just like the land, air, and sea. And he went on to say the U.S. objective is to achieve American dominance in space. Hardly anyone today objects to nations putting into orbit spy satellites that collect audio and visual intelligence on military operations or to provide early warning on ballistic missile launches, or using global positioning and satellite communications satellites. This has gone on for decades, and these satellites do not violate any of the provisions of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. Most nations, including the United States, have signed on to the treaty, which declares outer space to be a global commons to be used for peaceful purposes with fair access to all. But this is a very new and extremely dangerous ball game the Trump government and others are playing with the Space Force war-fighting strategy. But some are not worried at all. The Air Force general in charge of our nuclear weapons arsenal was full of praise, declaring, quote, I like the law Congress passed about what we have to do with space as a war-fighting domain. The former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy insisted that Congress should come to terms with the fact that space wars are inevitable, demanding, quote, we need to stop talking about trying to prevent war in space. Unfortunately, most members of Congress followed his advice. Only 48 members of Congress voted against the Space Force bill, 41 Democrats, and 7 Republicans. A general applauded the congressional vote, declaring, quote, we are at the space fighter table. We are not in the cheap seats anymore. Hooray. However, clear and more thoughtful political and military minds are not buying into that. They correctly fear that using the Space Force to establish U.S. domination of outer space will trigger a massive new arms race and a new Cold War that could turn very hot into a hot war with nations and people who are proclaimed the enemies of the American people. They worry that a space arms race would open a new pathway to war between nuclear-armed nations in an outer space environment where there are no established rules for military engagement. So who is the principal target of the Space Force? Clearly China, and to a lesser extent, Russia. The unsubstantiated claims made that China and Russia have already weaponized outer space and are now threatening US government and business satellites in space. That charge ignores the fact that Russia and China have tried to expand the 1967 Outer Space Treaty to ban all military weapons in space under a new treaty. The United States government, under both Republican and Democratic administrations, has refused to even enter into negotiations with other nations to write such a treaty. On June 17th, the Trump government released a new defense strategy report asserting that the United States must, quote, be capable of winning wars that extend into space, and declaring that space is now a distinct war-fighting domain. So how is organizing the Space Force and developing and winning space domination pose a real danger to worldwide plans to explore and establish human settlements on Mars? Well, let's take a look at the hard facts, not alternate facts or alternate realities, but real facts, and put misleading political propaganda aside. Right now, there are over 3,000 satellites in orbit around Earth. Several hundred are military satellites controlled by the United States, China, Russia, India, and several European nations. We can now assume that some of these satellites are space weapons that can be used to destroy satellites, but most are not weapons at all. Besides those operational satellites, we have an incredible number of big pieces of space debris that have not deorbited. On October 12th, the European Space Agency released its latest report detailing the debris. They list more than 25,000 tracked objects, including satellites, spent rocket stages, and general space debris. The head of the European Space Agency's Space Safety Program said, quote, the biggest contributor to the current space debris problem is explosions in orbit caused by leftover energy, fuels and batteries, onboard spacecraft and rockets. So what will happen if a space satellite, a space war, breaks out? What would actually happen, and what are they not talking about? We can only speculate how one of these space wars will evolve in low Earth orbit and beyond. But one thing is for certain, once it starts, it will be almost impossible to stop it from quickly escalating into a full-blown space, sea, and land ground war. Why is that? If a space war breaks out, that would quickly lead to an orbital cascade of space debris as hundreds of satellites are destroyed. It's called a Kessler chain reaction. The Kessler chain reaction would destroy most weather, communications, and all other satellites we depend upon in our daily lives. All of our modern technology based on satellites would quickly cease to function. No cell phones, no TV, no GPS, no internet, no electricity, no functioning factories. It's all gone. The world capitalist economy would collapse, causing a worldwide economic depression. It would make the economic consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic seem like a picnic. Our planet would be circled by millions of fragments of pulverized satellites. It would take decades to clean that mess up. A space war adventure would end human space exploration for decades, if not longer. The SpaceX, Starship, the SLS, and other planetary exploration projects would come to a crashing end. That's bad enough. However, a full-scale outer space war between major space powers would result in a far worse outcome. An outer space war would rapidly escalate into an all-out air, land, and sea nuclear exchange on our planet. It will not be confined to outer space. The beginning of a nuclear World War III could unfold in only hours, if perhaps just minutes, after the first satellites are destroyed. That worldwide military confrontation would threaten the very existence of our species and at best result in the collapse of civilization and a return to barbarism. President Eisenhower warned us in his final address about the military-industrial complex threat. And those very forces today are agitating for making outer space a war battleground. And it's very interesting that those space war advocates never, ever raise the Kessler syndrome. They deliberately ignore it. Some of these backward forces are looking forward maybe to the rapture or the second coming or other total nonsense. So is a U.S. war against China really possible? Who in their right mind is even considering such a war, much less preparing for it? Well, the Rand Corporation is. They wrote a report a few years ago called War with China, Thinking the Unthinkable. The report said that premeditated war between the United States and China is very unlikely, but the danger that a mishandled crisis could trigger hostilities cannot be ignored. While neither state wants war, both states' militaries have plans to fight one. The report continues. As Chinese military capabilities improve, the United States can no longer be so certain that war would follow its plan and lead to the decisive United States victory. The report laid out what preparations the United States should make should a war break out to ensure victory while minimizing losses and costs. Clearly absent from this study, Rand Corporation study, were two factors from the war document that weren't in there. First, the impact of the Kessler effect on America, China, the world was ignored. And secondly, how would North Korea respond to an attack on China? The report didn't say. Well, North Korea would not sit on their hands and be mere spectators as their neighbor and benefactor are under massive military assault. We would expect the mass mobilization of Korea's armed forces to invade South Korea, and they will certainly use their growing nuclear rocket arsenal. South Korea would be overrun in weeks. That scenario is pretty depressing, but it's not inevitable. It can be prevented. So what can we in the Mars Society and millions of people throughout the world who advocate the peaceful, scientific exploration of Mars and the cosmos, What can we do about it? What can we do to stop that? We need to continue doing what the Mars Society has been doing for 2 decades. Continue to organize and mobilize people to advocate for the peaceful exploration of our solar system. We aren't foolish enough in the Mars Society to believe that a space war can be won by anyone, or that a world war can be won by anyone. That kind of war has no winners, only massive suffering, death, and destruction. And another thing we need to do is draft and implement a new updated international outer space treaty that clearly prohibits any nation from placing any war-fighting satellites in orbit. The Artemis Accords won't get us there. The Artemis Accords are not designed to do that. The Artemis Accords will not become an international treaty accepted by most nations of the world. On the contrary, most nations, especially major spacefaring ones, view the Artemis Accords as an obvious attempt to dictate international policy regarding the moon rather than an honest effort to achieve an international policy negotiated and agreed to by the nations of the world. In fact, under US law, the Artemis Accords are prohibited from including China. They may not sign those accords even if they should agree with them under US law. So 3 of the 4 most significant spacefaring nations will probably not be part of or sign on to the Artemis Accords. China, Russia, probably not India. Right now, we started a few minutes late, so I'm going to have to cut a little bit. Right now, we're getting a lot of propaganda about this great conspiracy by Chinese students and professors, and probably anyone of Chinese descent, are engaged in a huge espionage attempt here in the United States to steal US rocket and other space technology. That's just one facet of the 24/7 anti-China propaganda we're getting. Under this propaganda barrage, Chinese scientists have been portrayed as backward, stupid people who can't develop any advanced space technology on their own. They have to steal everything from the United States and other nations. That's pure BS. However, if you look closely at both Chinese private and government rockets, you'll clearly see how they have stolen our great advanced world best American technology. You may have noticed that the Chinese placed their fairings, nose cones, at the top of the rockets. Now, where did they get that idea from? And their rocket engine nozzles are at the bottom of their rockets facing downward. Damn thieves. That was our idea. That and fireworks. There seems to be general agreement that US ban on China should be ended. And it's clear to be successful, our settlement on Mars will need to be a truly global effort by humankind and many nations, not a hostile conquest by international business competitors and warlike actions between nation states. Last August, our Mars Society president, Dr. Robert Zubrin, participated in a panel discussion on China and space exploration. You can see it on YouTube. The panel moderator asked Dr. Zubrin How should the nations of the world work together to make human Mars exploration happen as soon as possible? Dr. Zubin responded, quote, I think the best way is friendly competition, an Olympic spirited competition, that nations compete for the honor of who can do the most towards advancing humanity towards that goal. He continued, so I think that yes, we should go to Mars together, and Americans should equip a ship, and the Chinese should equip a ship, and the Europeans should equip a ship, and the Russians should equip a ship, and perhaps the Japanese should equip a ship, so we can all go together, so we can compete to see who can make the most discoveries and be the most innovative. We can be there helping each other. I think this is the most productive way to do this together than collapsing it all into one program. He continued, approach in the spirit of friendly competition, we can accomplish much more and can appreciate the excellence, courage, and creativity of each other as we share this adventure. And Dr. Zubrin concluded, I think we would have a more creative program if there were a number of different bases on Mars. Let each nation show its talent. And smaller nations which can't have their own individual program should join with one of the larger players. Let 1,000 flowers bloom. That's an old quote from Mao that Dr. Zubrin used. And as Dr. Zubrin, I, and most others realize, the flowers did bloom. However, they didn't bloom for very long. It didn't take long for the authoritarian Maoist regime to clamp down and destroy those promising flowers. I hope they bloom again soon. So Dr. Zubrin hit the nail on the head. And government leaders, space exploration leaders, business leaders, and space exploration enthusiasts of the world would be wise to follow Dr. Zubrin's suggestions. Once a global plan to explore and establish settlements on Mars gets well underway without space wars, something really fantastic may happen because we will have finally emerged as an intelligent, civilized race of space-faring beings. That human accomplishment, which would be our greatest in our history, that human accomplishment could very well lead to our first contact with other intelligent beings. They'd have a reason to want to have contact with us under those conditions. And when that happens, we will begin to learn about the incredible diversity and cultures that exist among thousands of intelligent species that exist just in our section of this vast galaxy. And when that happens, it will mean we listen to and follow the clear warning made by one of our heroes, Carl Sagan, and that we took action to protect our planet, our species, our moon, our Mars, our solar system. Our very survival is at stake. Carl Sagan wrote, quote, we've arranged a global civilization in which most crucial elements profoundly depend on science and technology. We have also arranged things so that almost no one understands science and technology. This is a prescription for disaster. We might get away with it for a while, but sooner or later, this combustible mixture of ignorance and power is going to blow up in our faces. End quote. So we can't and won't let anti-science morons control our human destiny in the United States and the rest of the world. We can beat them. We have the ability to win, and we don't have any other acceptable option. Well, thank you for your time. And questions, comments, disagreements?
There's been quite a bit going on in chat, so unfortunately, I don't think we're going to have time to go over everything with just the three
I'm
minutes
sorry, we
we have
started
left.
a little late too. We
Yeah,
started a couple minutes late. That didn't help.
but the first one I thought was interesting is that basically, considering that all objects in space are basically kinetic kill weapons.
I can hardly hear you. Can speak up just a
Oh,
little
sorry.
more, please. Sure.
Yeah, since all weapons or all spacecraft basically or objects in space are basically a kinetic impactor that can be
Yeah.
used as in a military sense. How would we actually deal with a ban? Because it doesn't seem like weapons alone would work. How would that treaty work out?
Well, the first time a weapon is used in space, here comes the Kessler syndrome. You have to have verifiable means of checking out any new satellites put in orbit, especially if they're secret satellites in terms of what they're designed for, and you'd have to have the ability to actually go up, check them out, look at their electronics, what do they look like, and and verify that they are in fact communication satellites, satellites for the internet, that they don't contain ammunition or the ability to either to attack and destroy any other satellite that's in orbit. The treaty would have to be verifiable, and I'm sure it could be. I'm sure the best engineers of the United States, China, Russia, the world could come up with a foolproof, verifiable technology to ensure there aren't any actual space weapons up there designed to destroy other satellites. I hope that answers the question adequately. We don't have a lot of time, and I don't have time to suggest things that you can read on that.
Looking down through here, there's quite a bit in the comments.
Yes, I noticed.
Let's see here. Okay. Space colonization will likely deal, like all human colonization, will never be purely peaceful. How will peaceful colonies deal with the Hitlers and Stalins that might emerge from Mars? Should a national Martian army be put into place in order to enforce peace? And this is basically, we're out of time. Thank you for your presentation, and I hope everybody got a chance or got something out of it. And if you have any questions, there is a Slack channel that we can set up to kind of discuss this more in detail. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and close the meeting out so we can head to our next track sessions. Thank you, and hope to see you in some of the next sessions.